It feels like this offseason is going a lot better for the Jets than last offseason. What are the differences? We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, March 29th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Today, we're going to talk about the 2024 Jets offseason so far. I think it's going better than the 2023 Jets offseason. In fact, I'd go as far to say 2023 was one of the worst Jets offseasons I've ever seen. And I understand, I'm going to throw the caveat in there. I know they made the Rodgers trade in 2023. I'm going to exclude that from the discussion because the Rodgers trade is a whole nother topic where we could talk about it for many shows. We will continue to. But if you take out the Rodgers trade, 2023 was a horrible offseason for the Jets. Nothing seemed to work. And even at the time, I was saying that a year ago, much to the chagrin of many of my listeners, but many listeners agreed with me. And as things played out, most of the additions the New York Jets made a year ago did not pan out. So why do things feel so different this year? And of course, the other caveat I'll throw out there is we're talking about this at the end of March. Things at the end of March don't always end up working out exactly the way we plan them by the end of the season. So that's the other caveat I'll throw out there. But I think what you've seen from the Jets so far this offseason have been a lot of sensible moves. They've been moves that address core needs in a realistic way. You think about what they did a year ago. You think about the positions that were weaknesses heading into this offseason. Part of the reason they were weaknesses heading into this offseason is the way the Jets addressed them in 2023 or did not address them in 2023. When you talk about the tackle position, the Jets went into 2023 with Mekhi Becton and Dwayne Brown. And, look, any fan can always talk themselves into something working as the season approaches, and Jets fans surely did. If we can squeeze another year out of Dwayne Brown, if Mekhi Becton can just stay healthy and play effectively. But that was always a lot to ask. It was really going to be tough for the Jets to get both of those things to happen. And the Jets needed both of those things to happen. And, of course, neither of them happened. Dwayne Brown played like 2 games before he got injured, and he played poorly in those 2 games. And then after he got back from injury, the Jets didn't even put him in the lineup. He was essentially an extra blocking tight end when he saw the field. Becton was coming off 2 straight years of where he missed the full season because of a knee injury, and he actually was able to stay healthy for the most part. A few bumps and bruises along the way, but was a very ineffective player. It was always going to be a lot to ask. In fact, this time last year, we were talking quite a bit about how the tackle position was a spot the Jets really needed to address in the draft. And of course, they were not able to address it in the draft, in part because of the Rodgers trade included a pick swap where they fell from 13 to 15. And then the last of the quote unquote elite tackle prospects from last year, Broderick Jones, went 14 when the Patriots traded down and the Steelers traded up to get Jones. This year, you have realistic options to fix the problems. Tyron Smith, heck of a tackle. A guy who's a borderline Hall of Famer, a guy who's had a tremendous career, and a guy who, even at 33, is still playing at a really high level. He was a second-team All-Pro in 2023. Injury risks aside, and they do exist, you have to feel good about where the Jets are at the left tackle position. I mean, it's as high of a ceiling as you can have at left tackle. Tyron Smith is still one of the best left tackles in the league, and when he's on the field, and of course, when he's on the field is the operative phrase because there is an injury risk, but the Jets got a guy who can be one of the best tackles in the NFL. And then you look to the right side, Morgan Moses, man, we know well, a guy who served the Jets very well in 2021. He was a guy that got, late in the offseason. He was a surprise cut by Washington, Jets went out and signed him, and he was supposed to be the primary backup tackle. And then Mekhi Becton goes down in 2021. Moses steps into the lineup and plays well as he's done through most of his career in Washington. That 1 year with the Jets, a couple of years in Baltimore. By all accounts, he's still playing at a pretty high level. He's 33 years old, so like Smith, there's some risk of aging there. There's some risk of injury, but not as much as Smith. Moses missed 3 games last year, but those were the first 3 games he missed in 8 years. So, some risk as you age, maybe you become a little bit more injury prone, but Moses has always been a very durable player. And you look at this tackle combination. A year ago, the Jets tackle combination on paper was one that you had to talk yourself into. Heading into 2024, the Jets tackle combination on paper looks pretty good. There are the questions: are they going to decline, or are they going to get injured? But you look at it and you say, you know what? If these guys stay healthy, this is going to be pretty good. Opposed to last year, where you didn't really know. Like, your best case scenario was like, let's hope Dwayne Brown doesn't continue to decline, because he was already in decline. And Mekhi Becton was like, can this guy stay healthy? And if he can stay healthy, how good is he? How good is he going to be? There were some question marks at this tackle position, but the upside is so much higher, and it's realistic upside. It's not like you have to talk yourself into this being a really good tackle group. You look at the wide receiver position. What did the Jets do a year ago? They brought in Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb. And, some people were excited about Lazard, but if you look at what he was in Green Bay, it was nothing to get excited over. And Cobb was one that was Cobb was one of the most confounding signings of the offseason, which any team had. And we know why they did it, because he and Rodgers are tight. And in theory, he and Rodgers had good chemistry, and maybe Rodgers trusted him on passing downs. But Randall Cobb was clearly at the end of his career. And what did he do? He had 5 catches. He gave the Jets 0. Now, I still think the Jets have some work to do at the wide receiver position, but they brought in Mike Williams this year. Again, talking about upside, Mike Williams is a guy who's had multiple 1,000-yard seasons. Allen Lazard was a guy who, even as like the primary option in Green Bay's passing game, had less than 800 yards in 15 games in 2022. And that was the best season of his career, at least as far as the counting stats go. Allen Lazard was never a terribly productive player. Mike Williams is. Again, Mike Williams has some risks attached to him. He's going to turn 30. He's coming off a torn ACL. But I think like even the injury risks might be a little overstated. This is a guy who's never really been that banged up through his career. He hasn't suffered a ton of serious injuries, and he brings a skill set the Jets have lacked. And he brings an upside that Lazard and Cobb lacked. Mike Williams could be a high-end second option in a passing game. And the Jets have a good number 1 option in the passing game in Garrett Wilson. So everything's better this year. And Mike Williams adds elements such as, deep ball ability. Garrett Wilson's not really a deep threat. Mike Williams has always been a pretty solid deep threat through his career. Mike Williams adds size. Now, I think that, when you talk about red zone performance, the thing that's good and most improved the Jets' red zone performance is having Aaron Rodgers instead of Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, and Trevor Siemian. But having a guy, and I think sometimes the concept of the red zone threat's a little overrated. If you look at some of the great receivers in the league, their touchdowns can vary from year to year. But having a little bit more size and having a guy who can go out and win jump balls, that's a good thing. Having somebody who can beat physical press coverage, that's an area where Garrett really struggles. Mike Williams is a bigger receiver. He can do that. He brings a lot to the table that the Jets lacked, and he brings an upside that was not there at the wide receiver position. Now, we still have Xavier Gibson penciled in as the number 3 receiver in the slot, but Mike Williams adds a lot to the table that the guys from the team last year did not add. Now, head on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue talking about why this offseason is better than last offseason. I like what the Jets are doing so much better in 2024 than I did in 2023. And we're going to get into why some of the moves make sense, why some of these were targeted, reasonable gambles, continuing this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel will let you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. And if you were watching the NCAA tournament last night, I'm going to bet your bracket was busted. I don't want to give any spoilers, because I know some people record the games, go to bed, watch them the next day. Let's just say chalk did not hold up last night at the NCAA tournament. And who knows what's going to happen tonight on the second night of the Sweet 16. Well, now you don't have to worry if your bracket is busted because, again, on FanDuel, you can bet on every game of the tournament and you get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/locked on. Again, it's FanDuel.com/locked on and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And a big shout out to everydayers, folks who listen to this podcast every single day. If you're one of them, maybe you have Fox Sports or ESPN on the TV all day, and you probably have to turn the volume down with all that shouting. Well, let me tell you about a new place you can go. You can make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about why this offseason is looking better than last offseason for the New York Jets. I was not satisfied with what the Jets did last offseason, much more satisfied with what they've done this offseason. I think there's probably a good bet you agree with me. You saw how things worked out in 2023, and you're probably much more happy with how things are working out this year. And I think in the first segment, we talked about how there's much more upside in the moves the Jets made this year than there was last year. And that alone takes the Jets ceiling much higher. Last year, there was all this talk about how the Jets were a Super Bowl contender. The Jets were the most hyped team through the offseason, but there were some pretty glaring holes on this roster, and there were some pretty big issues that probably would have come to the forefront even had Aaron Rodgers stayed healthy. This year, they're addressing them, but they're also addressing them in a very smart and targeted way. And what I mean by that is a year ago, the Jets really made some financial decisions that were baffling. They restructured a ton of contracts. They pushed a ton of dead money to the future. In fact, this year, the Jets have over $30 million in dead money on their salary cap for guys who are not productive. I'm talking guys like Carl Lawson. I'm talking guys like Laken Tomlinson. They're just players who were not productive for this team, and they decided to push this money to the future. CJ Uzomah is another one. The Jets cut him, but they got a far bigger bill than they would have because they restructured his contract last year and added all this dead money to his deal. These were bad decisions. These were decisions that are having an impact on the Jets this offseason because that $30 million could go to improving the team even further. But I'm happy because it kind of feels like the Jets have struck the right balance this offseason. My concern heading into the offseason was the Jets were going to continue this path. They were going to push even more dead money to the future and leave themselves in an even tougher financial spot. Now, this Rodgers contract is going to become unfavorable in the years ahead. But if that's the only issue you've got, it's easier to work around than restructuring everybody. And this is where I think the Jets have kind of threaded the needle because they've gotten Tyron Smith and they've gotten Morgan Moses and they've gotten Mike Williams. But they've also gotten them at reasonable prices. Tyron Smith, is only costing $6.5 million guaranteed. Mike Williams, only $10 million guaranteed. Morgan Moses had a reasonable contract to begin with. Well, the Jets probably should have brought him back in 2022 at that price, but no use crying over spilt milk. They've brought these guys in at reasonable contracts, and this is going to kind of like help the Jets reset their salary cap so that they're not going to be as rough of a cap shape in the future. It was my concern, and I think it wasn't an unfair concern based on the way the Jets were acting last year. Joe Douglas has not done a good job with the Jets salary cap. I mean, there are lots of areas where Joe Douglas has not done a great job with this team, but the way he structured contracts, the way he's run the cap is not one of them. And again, part of that you're seeing play out this year where the Jets were very tight up against the cap and they had to make these low cost moves. Fortunately, they were able to find low cost moves with high upsides. And the fact that they're not pushing all this dead money to the future, that's a positive. That means that, this is going to amount to something of a reset year for their cap. Not completely, but it gives them an opportunity to at least have a little bit more flexibility in 2025 and beyond. And look, there are costs to mismanaging your cap. I don't want to sit here and act like there's no consequences to it, because I think too many times people don't understand the salary cap, so they act like it's no big deal if you run your cap poorly. People act like unless you have to like completely gut your roster, every team's cap management is the same. That's not always true. For example, the Jets' salary cap management this year probably cost them Bryce Huff, or at least cost them a chance to trade Huff and get an asset for him because they were not able to use the franchise tag. And I think part of the reason they let him go is they did not think they could afford the $17 million. So Joe Douglas's bad cap management has had a negative impact on the team. But it feels like we're kind of moving in the right direction cap wise. And while we're moving in the right direction cap wise, we've put a team on the field and we've addressed the needs in a way that gives the Jets a really high upside. It takes the tackle position from a major weakness into a spot that could become quite a strength for this team. It takes the wide receiver position from a spot where you only had one quality receiver to a spot where you have two really high end receivers. And if they both stay healthy, you're going to be okay there. And I mean, they still need to find somebody to replace Xavier Gipson but with Garrett and with Mike Williams in the mix, they don't need to do quite as much. It's not quite as pronounced. So it's not just that they've found guys who have high upsides. And with Rodgers in the mix, you want guys with high upsides because you want to give this team, if everything goes right, Super Bowl potential. You don't want to sit around. You don't get Aaron Rodgers to win 9 games. You don't get Aaron Rodgers to win 10 games in a wild card and go out in the first round. You get Aaron Rodgers to try and go on a run. And it's difficult to see how the Jets could have gone on a run with Alan Lazard as their number 2 receiver, with Dwayne Brown as their starting left tackle, with Mekhi Becton as their starting right tackle. The current team, look, I'm not going to lie to you. This current team's not the favorite in the AFC. But if things go right, if they make maybe 1 or 2 more moves, this could be a team that's dangerous. And they've done it in a way that they're kind of resetting it where they're not. I never use the phrase mortgage their future because I don't believe you ever really mortgage your future in the NFL. You're always a year or 2 away from clearing out your cap situation and turning things around. But they're doing it in a way where they're starting to reduce the damage, at least in the out years, in the years in the future, where it's not going to be as damaging as it would have been if they continued to restructure these contracts, if they continued to add dead money. It was a tightrope. It was a needle that Joe Douglas had to thread this offseason. Look, and I don't want to give Joe Douglas too much credit before I see the results on the field, because this GM has received a lot of credit in past off seasons for things that have not worked out. So I'm at the point with Douglas where, I need to see it work before I'm willing to give him effusive praise. But I think, given the options in front of him, balancing the short term and the long term for this franchise, Douglas has made the decisions that I think were probably the best decisions that were possible based on what we know right now. And I think that a lot of this, I think the Jets have really done well in many ways this offseason. It's not been a perfect offseason. Losing Huff was not great. I think some of the contracts they gave out Javon Kinlaw were questionable. Even giving Tyrod Taylor 2 years guaranteed. I like Tyrod Taylor. I like bringing him in as the backup. I don't know that was necessarily the best move, but I think that heading into this offseason, the objectives I had for the Jets were dealing with their biggest needs in a high upside way and finding a way to do it where you're not damaging your future cap. And I think the Jets have done both of those so far. So, far better than they did a year ago, where they were just making a lot of moves that frankly made no sense. But the work's not done. As we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets, we're going to talk about what else the New York Jets need to do, what's left to accomplish this offseason, and I'll give you a hint. Most of it's on the draft. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Friday. We're talking about the 2024 Jets offseason. So far, pretty good job, I think, by the Jets. They've addressed their core needs. They've done it in a targeted way. They've not really damaged their future salary cap. Essentially, it's the opposite of what they did a year ago, but there's still work to be done, and most of it will come in the NFL draft. Now, that's not to say free agency is over. There are still players who are available who, the market's fallen out for them. They'll be available. They'll be cheap. They'll be available in April. Some of them will be available in May. Some will even be available in June, maybe July. And a smart signing at that time of the calendar can make a big difference for your team, because these are players that are not going to cost a lot of money. Usually something has happened where they did not get the money they were hoping for in the offseason. They might be recovering from an injury. They might be, kind of older, just trying to hang on in the NFL. And some of these players can help your team quite a bit. And I look at this. I think the safety position is a spot where the Jets will probably look to increase their depth. Maybe is there a wide receiver who can help them? Perhaps maybe some offensive line depth. There's some guys available. We'll likely talk about them in the days and weeks ahead. But most of the focus is on the NFL draft right now. And I think what the Jets have done this offseason is they've plugged short-term needs. The spots that were black holes, that were dire, no longer feel like black holes. And the Jets head into the NFL draft with, maybe you'd call it, some flexibility. And by flexibility, what I mean is that they're not going to feel like they have to reach for a player at 10 at a certain position. If the Jets did not sign Tyron Smith, there'd be a lot of pressure on them to draft a tackle at 10. If they did not sign Mike Williams, there'd be a lot of pressure for them to draft a wide receiver at 10. The thing about the draft, though, is that you should not use it as a tool to address short-term needs. It's great if you have a Garrett Wilson or Sauce Gardner who steps in and is immediately an impact player. It makes a big difference for your franchise. You don't want to be in that position, though. You want to give your rookies the chance to come in, play at their own pace. Maybe they're just like a role player year one and they develop into a starter in year two. And I think that's what the Jets have done for the most part this offseason. I do think they're going to have to address offensive line because I don't think you can count on Smith to be there for 17 games. But for the most part, if this is the roster you go into opening day with next year, you feel very good about the starters. I think, though, if you look longer term, if you look at the horizon, past the horizon, things don't look as bright for this team because they don't have young talent at a number of the core spots. Quarterback's number one among them. The quarterback's 40 years old right now. He's going to the Hall of Fame, but he's going to the Hall of Fame sooner rather than later. The Jets don't have a long-term solution at quarterback. They don't have a long-term solution at tackle either. Smith and Moses project as a formidable duo at the tackle position, but they're both 33 and they're both in the final year of their contract. Jets do not have a starting tackle for 2025 on their roster right now. At the wide receiver position, Mike Williams, great addition, great great compliment to Garrett Wilson, high-end receiver, high-end number 2 type target, but he's not under contract for next year, and he's 30 years old. So if you look at the offense, the key positions, you have the quarterback, you have 2 tackles, and 3 starting receivers. So of those 6 spots, the Jets have 1 long-term player. And that's where the draft comes in this year. And fortunately for the Jets, I think the 10th overall pick, it's likely, I don't think they're going to take a quarterback, but the other 2 spots, tackle and receiver, it's likely there's going to be a good tackle or receiver available to them there. That will at least help them begin to replenish the well at these positions. And, again, you're not necessarily drafting a guy for this year, although I think if you draft a tackle this year, he'll probably see some playing time because with these older tackles, especially Smith, who's more injury prone, you're going to have to deal with injuries at some point. I think with Tyron Smith, the upside, the hope is that he can play like 13 to 14 games, but you're probably going to have 3 to 4 games at least where somebody has to fill in. And Moses, although he's been durable, when you get to 33, there is a little bit of an enhanced injury risk. So it'd be good to have like an insurance guy at the tackle position. And at wide receiver, well, first of all, Xavier Gibson's a starter at the moment, so you'd love to bump him to the bench. And if you draft somebody at 10th overall, well, they're only going to have to be like the 3rd option in the passing game. And that's a good way to bring in a rookie. Not a lot of pressure. Now, with the 10th overall pick, you're expecting a guy to play at least a little bit. You're not expecting a guy to be glued to the bench all season, but you don't want him to have to carry the offense. And in a situation where you have Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams, the 3rd guy it's a perfect spot for a rookie because he can come in and he can be the 3rd option. He's not going to have to deal with tough coverages. He's not going to deal with the tough assignments against corners. He's not going to have a lot on his plate. He'll just be able to go out there and play. And if he's just a contributor, you'll feel pretty good about it. If he does a little bit more, that's fine. I mean, listen, a rookie can always earn more of a target share, and then he'll essentially take over the number 2 job from Mike Williams in a year. This is the spot you want to be in if you're the Jets. You don't want to feel like you're in a tight situation where you have to fill these needs through the draft immediately. These are longer term needs, however, for the Jets, and that's why I don't think these signings really change a whole lot as far as draft strategy goes. I think they change the rationale where now you're not necessarily reaching for these spots because they're needs, because you need to fill them immediately. I think it's more along the lines that these are longer term needs. Now we can get guys in here. They're not going to be under a lot of pressure to step into the starting lineup. Now, again, if you get a tackle, it was really good. They may end up starting at right tackle over Morgan Moses, but you got depth there. You got depth. And even if Smith goes down, Moses can go into the lineup and you'll be fine. And at the receiver position, you can relax. You just have a guy who steps in, who plays a role, who's a guy who gets his feet wet a little bit, becomes part of the passing game, and then maybe takes on a bigger role in year 2. It's a good spot to be in, but this work still remains. And the Jets still, even if it's not necessarily all for the immediate future, the Jets still need to address these positions for the future because there's not enough at the key offensive spots as far as young talent goes. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.